listening to Parasearch UK Radio. News, views and reviews from the world of the paranormal from across the UK and beyond. Find us on Facebook, Twitter and the World Wide Web. Parasearch UK Radio.
The views and opinions expressed by presenters and guests are their own and do not necessarily reflect the official policy or position of Parasearch UK Radio or its affiliates and sponsors. Listener discretion is advised. Welcome to Haunted Histories with your host Penny G. Morgan, right here on Parasearch UK Radio.
Hello everyone, and a very good Wednesday evening to you all. It's Penny G. Morgan here of Haunted Histories on Parasearch Radio UK, bringing you the history and the paranormal around the world. Your historical haunted hostess, with some may say the mostess. So, last week we visited the ominous Cecil Hotel with my very special guest, Mr. Christopher St. Booth. If you haven't had a chance to listen to that particular show, don't worry, you haven't missed the boat. You can still go and have a listen. In fact, you can go and play it and download it at any time. If you go via our website, Spreaker, amongst other things, YouTube, there's quite a few places where you can go and have a listen. I did hear from someone last week about the Cecil. Apparently she lived there for about a month in 2007. And she said that it was genuinely an incredibly eerie place to be. She said she lived on the 10th floor for that month and kept hearing furniture moving around in the room opposite across the corridor. After a while, she got so fed up with the constant noise that she called down to reception to complain, to be told that the room in question was empty and had been for a very long time. Apparently they even opened up the room to prove it, and there was no one in there. So it's obvious the place has an awful lot of residual energy going on there. But thank you ever so much, the Third Sight Paranormal Events, for sharing that one with us. Third Sight, interestingly, are actually based in Coventry Way. So if you want to chat to someone about the Cecil Hotel who's been there, give Third Sight Paranormal Events a quick call. So, where are we today? Well, I thought I would bring us back across the pond and head north of Watford for today's show. I say north of Watford, I'm based in Essex, so Watford is pretty north for me. Although some of the historical information I'm going to be talking to does actually relate to the whole of the UK, including Ireland, Northern Ireland. Well, we're going to be visiting a place called Ripon Workhouse in North Yorkshire. And after the break, I'm going to be joined by Rosie and Stuart of Simply Ghost Nights, who are the resident paranormal investigation team at said workhouse. They will have some very interesting experiences to tell us, as they actually visited there last week. They're there on a monthly basis. There's so much information that we could go through when discussing workhouses in general that I feel that maybe a brief summary of how this dreaded place came into being, well, I feel it might be useful to go through some of it. Obviously nowadays we have the welfare state. Poverty shouldn't exist in the way that it did. But the thing is with poverty, you can look at it as in comparison of what's actually going on in the rest of society. So it used to be that if you didn't have a washing machine, you could be classed as being poor. Now there's other things that might class you as being, I suppose, on the lower rungs, as they would say. But the poor law legislations can be traced back as far as the early 1500s, with what became known as the Old Poor Law under Elizabeth I. And then the New Poor Law, which was passed in 1834. This actually wasn't the earliest type of statute to try and control the poor. This could be traced back even further to the mid-1300s under Edward III. After an estimated 30 to 40% of people had died from the Black Death, this required everyone to work. There was so much competition for workers amongst the employers that the wages had been driven up, which meant the prices for goods which had been driven up, and people were struggling to live. There was actually subsequent acts that followed that punished workers for fleeing and becoming freemen. But tied workers and everything is a whole different subject and is a whole other historical area in itself. Remember, monasteries were also there to give alms to the poor, but after the dissolution of the monasteries with the Reformation in the Tudor times, poor relief became an actual compulsory tax collected at parish level. This was actually only intended for who were known as the impotent poor. Those were people who were elderly, infirm, or couldn't work for some reason. The able-bodied, those who begged, and those who could otherwise work were expected to, and could receive quite harsh punishments if they did not. I found stories of beggars being hung for repeated begging offences. The workhouse movement, as we've come to know it, probably commenced properly really at the end of the 17th century, so the very late 1600s. But this was actually parish-based, and therefore it was run in quite a haphazard way. The original idea being that the parish could earn money from the residents of these places. However, with the vast majority either being elderly, infirm, or children who weren't going to be profitable, this idea quickly proved to be worthless. Then we come to the Victorian age. Yes, I know I'm jumping around my centuries quite a bit, but I'm sure you don't want to hear about all the intricate details. This is the workhouse age we are probably most familiar with, thanks to authors such as Charles Dickens. Because following a royal commission into the poor laws, they proposed two overarching principles that A. The pauper should have to enter the workhouse with conditions worse than that of the poorest free labourer outside of the workhouse, and that relief should only be available in the workhouse, i.e. nothing would be given to people who didn't come into the workhouse. That was the method of control of the poor relief. The final act, in 1834, was watered down slightly with these two principles, with outdoor alms still continuing to be given. But a major change in this period was the removal of the parish-run workhouses and a switch to what became known as poor law unions. Previously, it's believed that there was almost 2,000 parish workhouses being run. Something like 1 in 7 parishes had a workhouse of varying sizes. After the unions were formed, the workhouses were in the hundreds rather than thousands. But don't be fooled into thinking this meant less poor. It was still a similar kind of amount, a similar percentage, but they were housed on a much, much larger scale. Whether you knew back then, I'm sure none of you lived back then. If you did, that's a pretty neat trick. But whether you knew the local workhouse as the Bastille or the Spike or the Workus or simply the house, it was a cause of dread and shame for many people who had to go into them. It was seen as the last resort, and this was exactly what the authorities intended. It wasn't meant to encourage people not to work. It wasn't meant to be seen as your choice was you either work or you go in the workhouse. It was meant to be foreboding. It was meant to be intimidating. But for some, there was absolutely no choice. You look at any of the workhouses built during the Victorian era and you'll notice similarities in their designs. You can get quite adept when driving round, spotting buildings, and when looking up finding out a lot were workhouses in a former life. Or maybe that's just me, maybe I am just a historical nerd that I get quite excited when I spot a new one and find out it was actually a workhouse. A lot of hospitals were primarily workhouses with a very small infirmary unit, for example. The late St John's Hospital in Chelmsford was one such place. There are certain features that the newer workhouses had and were architecturally designed to have. A large gate which you had to walk through to get to the administration block, for example. The entrance to the Birmingham Union House was through what they called and became known as the Archway of Tears. You would be expected to be interviewed, establish your circumstances, so the shame of the reason that you were there would be exposed, once again, for all to see and hear. You could be an unmarried mother to whose family had thrown her out in shame. You could be elderly and unable to keep a roof over your head. Remember, there was no welfare state. You could be a husband who had lost his job and had to take his whole family to the workhouse to keep them safe. There were quite strict rules regarding families, in that if a husband was going into the workhouse, if he had a family, they had to come too, and similarly he couldn't leave without them. If he wanted to be discharged, he had to take his entire family with him. But you've taken that family in, and you know that you're going to be split up.